On April 28th of this year, employees at a barbecue chain called Smokey Bones showed up to work like it was any other day. Some of them found the doors locked, no warning, no meeting, just a notice taped to the glass. Every remaining Smokey Bones in the country closed, all on the same day. That's not one bad location having a bad year. That's the end of a 26-year-old restaurant chain, gone in a single afternoon. And it's not alone. TGI Fridays has lost nearly 200 locations since 2024. Hooters filed for bankruptcy. On the Border went from over 100 locations to a total liquidation. If you've eaten at any of these places in the last 10 years, you've watched a piece of American dining quietly disappear. Welcome to the BizClubPodcast. There's a story happening in the restaurant industry right now that deserves more than a headline. And if you've ever run a restaurant, worked in one, or just love eating at one, you need to understand what's actually going on. This isn't a story about people eating out less. It's more complicated than that. And today we're laying out the whole picture before we go deep on each of these collapses in the episodes ahead. Let's start with the number that should stop you in your seat. An estimated 8,171 restaurants closed across the US and Canada in just the first 6 months of 2026. That's not a slow year. That's not normal churn. That's restaurants disappearing at a pace of roughly 45 a day. And it's not just small, unknown places. Chain-affiliated restaurants accounted for over half of those closures, 4,253 of them. These are brands with marketing budgets, established customer bases, and corporate backing, and they're closing right alongside the independents. Texas led the country with over 1,000 closures in 6 months. New York, California, Illinois, and North Carolina rounded out the top 5. This isn't a regional problem. It's happening everywhere. Here's what makes this moment strange, though, and it's important to understand before we go further. Industry-wide, restaurant sales are actually projected to grow this year, pushing toward $1.5 trillion nationally. So how do you have record closures and rising sales at the same time? The answer is the whole story of this year. Growth is happening because prices are going up, not because more people are eating out. Value is up. Visits are flat or falling. That gap, rising sales dollars covering up falling traffic, is exactly what's hiding underneath every one of these bankruptcy headlines. And here's why that distinction matters so much. A headline number like industry sales are up makes it easy for an owner to assume things are fine. It's the same trap we talked about in our very first episode of this show. Revenue climbing while margin quietly disappears underneath it. Except now, we're seeing it play out at the scale of an entire industry, not just one restaurant. When the top-line number looks healthy, it's tempting to stop asking harder questions. That's exactly the moment you need to be asking them. Let's put faces on this because these aren't obscure brands. These are places most of us have actually eaten at. TGI Fridays is maybe the most dramatic case. At its peak in 2008, it had over 600 US locations. It filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November of 2024. Since the start of that year, it's lost nearly 200 locations, dropping from 269 down to roughly 76 today. That's a company that once defined casual American dining, reduced to a fraction of what it was in about 2 years. Hooters filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2025. Interestingly, Hooters shares a private equity owner with TGI Fridays, which tells you something important we'll come back to in future episodes. This isn't only about food costs. It's also about how these companies were financially structured in the first place. On the Border, the Mexican restaurant chain, entered 2025 with around 120 locations. It closed 40 non-performing corporate stores in February and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy that March. Here's the twist most people missed. It didn't die there. Houston-based Pappas Restaurants bought the brand out of bankruptcy in May 2025 and spent a year trying to turn it around. New menu, upgraded operations, a real rescue attempt. Then, in June of this year, it collapsed anyway. On June 12th, all 28 remaining company-owned locations closed without warning. A week later, the company filed for Chapter 7 liquidation. A brand that looked like it had been saved was gone within 13 months of its rescue. Today, only a handful of independently owned franchise locations still carry the name. Smokey Bones, the barbecue chain we opened with, had already been shrinking for years under its parent company, before Chapter 11 protection in January of 2026 led to that final, sudden, all-at-once closure of every remaining location in April. 4 different brands, 4 different specific stories. But underneath every single one of them, the same set of pressures shows up again and again. Rising food costs, rising labor costs, heavy debt loads, and customers who are simply more careful about when and where they spend money eating out. So why is this all converging right now, in 2026? 3 forces, stacking on top of each other. First, food and labor costs have both risen sharply. Food and labor costs combined have increased 35% over the last 5 years. Menu prices have followed, up 31% over roughly the same period. When your 2 biggest expenses climb by a third, and you can only raise prices so far before customers push back, your margin gets squeezed from both sides at once. Second, consumer behavior has genuinely shifted. People haven't stopped eating out completely, but for a lot of households, it's moved from being a weekly habit to something closer to an occasional treat. That shift matters enormously for a casual dining chain built around steady, frequent visits. It's a very different business than one built around occasional splurges. Third, and this is the piece that often gets missed, a lot of these companies were carrying heavy debt loads from years before this squeeze even started. Several of these chains have been owned by private equity firms, structured with debt that made sense when times were good, but became unsustainable the moment margins got tight. When a company already has heavy debt obligations and then gets hit with rising costs and softer traffic at the same time, there's very little room left to absorb the shock. That's why some of these stories aren't slow declines. They're sudden. The debt load meant there was no cushion left once the other pressures hit. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it changes how you should read every one of these headlines. A bankruptcy filing isn't always proof that a brand stopped mattering to customers. Often, the restaurants themselves were still running. People were still ordering the same appetizers, still filling the same booths. What gave out was the financial structure sitting on top of the business, built for a different economic environment than the one it eventually had to survive. Here's an important nuance, and it's one we'll spend time on in future episodes. This isn't a story about the entire restaurant industry collapsing. It's more specific than that. Quick service and value-focused concepts are actually leading a lot of the closure numbers too, which surprises people. But a huge share of that is smaller, newer locations, often with under 25 seats, closing in their first couple years. That's a different story from a 20-year-old casual dining brand failing. Meanwhile, plenty of operators, especially value-focused and fast casual concepts, are genuinely thriving in this same environment because they're built around exactly what today's customer wants: predictable pricing, speed, and a lower bar for "is this worth it tonight?" The pattern becoming clear across the industry is this: operators who are closely tracking their actual costs, food, labor, waste, line by line, are pulling ahead. The ones who aren't are the ones showing up in these bankruptcy filings. Pricing alone isn't saving anyone anymore. Operators have mostly run out of room to simply raise prices further. The advantage now belongs to whoever controls their costs most precisely. That's the split defining this whole era of the restaurant industry. Dining out versus not dining out. But operators who adapted their model to this new cost environment versus operators who kept running the old playbook and hoped it would hold. That's the big picture. And it's the frame for everything we're covering. We're going to go deep on several of these individual stories. Exactly what happened inside TGI Fridays' collapse. The very different way private equity ownership played into Hooters' bankruptcy. And the story of On the Border. Rescued once and gone anyway. We're also going to talk about what's actually working. The restaurants and operators pulling ahead in this same environment, and what every independent restaurant owner watching this can actually learn and apply, regardless of the size of your business. This is the BizClubPodcast, with real stories, real numbers, and real lessons for anyone building or running a business right now. In the next episode, we're going deep on TGI Fridays, from 600 locations to under 80, and exactly how it happened. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Until next time, know your numbers before they know you. God bless.